What happens when one of Hollywood's most legendary hard-edged stars literally walks into a room that is already charged with tension? That which was scheduled to be a simple promotional appearance has in an instant completely gone in a direction nobody anticipated. As Clint Eastwood took his place on The View, no one imagined the conversation that would unfold and reach the point of sheer pandemonium. In a matter of moments, what was just a routine celebrity talk show appearance began to feel like a powder keg about to be ignited. And the consequence that resulted was completely unexpected. This was not a moment where just any old awkward TV show conversation went a little uncomfortable. This was the prime example of how quickly an uncontrollable firestorm could ignite in response to opposing personalities colliding, deep-seated beliefs clashing, and it's not just a good television moment or an interesting celebrity exchange getting a bit strange. This was a first-hand observation of how quickly things can ignite. But before we jump into this story, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts, because that one moment where Hollywood's most respected stars and that group of hosts came head-to-head felt like less of a morning chat show and more like watching an uncontrolled wildfire unfold. The moment Clint Eastwood walked onto that set, there was something palpable in the air. At 94 years old, he radiated that same aura of controlled power that he had become synonymous with. He did not need to demand attention. He commanded it through his mere presence. However, even in the few minutes before the camera rolled that morning, felt off. What should have been small talk during the commercial breaks felt manufactured. The smiles were just a tad too forced, the laughter a bit too rehearsed. Joy Behar looked like she was analyzing every line of her script, like she was preparing for a doctoral defense. Whoopi Goldberg seemed strangely quiet, just calmly flipping through her cue cards. Sunny Hostin had a tightness to her jaw, which viewers would recognize immediately as the predictor of an impending verbal brawl, and Sarah Haynes' bright demeanor faltered as the energy on set seemed to shift like storm clouds starting to roll in. Alyssa Farah Griffin appeared particularly nervous, like she somehow knew she would end up in the middle of a fight that had nothing to do with her. Officially, Eastwood was on The View to talk about his most recent directorial project. At least that was the stated reason. Once the cameras started rolling, however, there was something else simmering below the surface. The introductions felt more like a formal declaration than a greeting. The hosts spoke with enthusiasm that bordered on overly animated. "We're so excited to welcome the legendary Clint Eastwood to the show today," Whoopi declared, but there was a distinct lack of her usual warmth and friendly tone. Then she continued in a way that clearly signaled an attack was forthcoming. "A renowned director, an acclaimed actor, and someone who's never been afraid to speak his mind on the issues facing our country." The words themselves didn't just fill the space. They hung in the air like a challenge. And Clint Eastwood, a man who spent his career playing and observing characters like that on screen, long before they uttered a single word, instantly felt it. His gaze narrowed, that famous familiar Eastwood look that had unnerved countless characters on screen, now fixed upon the panel before him. Leaning forward, his gruff, familiar voice rumbled, "Well, I appreciate being here." Eastwood reclined a little, then said something that was remarkably gentle, yet somehow made the entire situation feel so much heavier. "I guess I'm going to have to admit," he said as a slight expression flickered across his face, "that I may have misjudged what this conversation was going to be about." Joy Behar immediately shifted forward from her seat, her smile in place. "Oh, we definitely want to talk about your movies, Clint," she chirped. "But we also think people want to hear about what you think is going on with the country right now." Her emphasis on the words "bigger issues" immediately set the tone. It wasn't going to be about movies and Hollywood stories and decades of cinematography. This was something completely different, taking shape right before Eastwood's eyes, and there was no mistaking the direction it was going to go. This was a man who had spent decades in tough rooms and tricky situations, who had never been afraid to swim in the deep end. He knew when the trap door was swinging open beneath him. A barely discernible shift in his expression. "I am here to talk about my work," he said evenly. "If you were trying to have a political fight, you should have invited a politician." Before anyone had the chance to steer the conversation back to safer waters, Sunny Hostin stepped forward quickly, her words coated in an undeniable sharpness. "But Clint, you've never exactly shied away from stating your own personal opinions, have you? You've publicly endorsed views, and even individuals that would be considered highly problematic by many of your viewers." Suddenly the room felt incredibly small. You could actually feel people around you shift in their chairs, an undercurrent of discomfort washing over the studio. The atmosphere was irrevocably changed. The very reason people showed up that afternoon was for a few light stories about movie stardom and behind-the-scenes peeks into Hollywood. Now there was an entirely different spectacle unfolding before them. And then there was a silence so prolonged it seemed to last for an eternity. Eastwood finally responded, taking his time as though he were personally weighing every single word that was about to be spoken. I've always thought people should say what they think, he said quietly. And I have always thought that one should respect the views of others, even if they are not what you think. That is becoming difficult to see of late, he said simply after a brief pause. And there was no doubt what he meant. Whoopi's expression tightened a little. Joy's smile stretched even further than it was before, and the room had clearly crossed a boundary, and everybody knew it. Sarah Haynes also realized that the atmosphere had changed, but in the hope that she could guide the conversation to a place that was still somewhat familiar, she began to ask questions of Eastwood about the specifics of his craft and how he approached making movies. By now, though, the carriage had moved past the station and could not be brought back. Speaking of disagreeing opinions, she cut in as though responding to something previously unsaid. Clint, what is it that you think of the current political climate in the country right now? Do you feel that the level of disagreement is a positive for our democracy? And here is where things get interesting. Because it really was not a question at all, it was a statement and an invitation. No matter how Clint responded to it, there would be a way to spin his response, either defending honest discourse or criticizing it. Every angle seemed to be a dead end, but Eastwood had been trapped by these kind of situations 100 times in his life, and you could see the expression in his eyes. He knew how this worked, and there was no way that he was going to fall for it. I think one of the biggest threats to the country right now, he said, his voice remaining perfectly steady and unyielding against the charged atmosphere, is the idea that influence should be used to silence others who don't agree with you. If you create a culture of one side is heard and the other side isn't, that's not defending democracy. That's undermining democracy. Eastwood paused. Then the room was filled with an indescribable deadening silence and awkward heaviness that made the whole room appear 10 pounds smaller. Chairs and tables and candles all seemed to hold their breath. For a moment, everything in the room seemed to freeze, and everyone in the room realized that they had just entered something that had gone beyond them, and no one could quite define it yet. But while the heat of the room grew heavier, the two sitting at the other end of the table cast each other furtive glances so full of meaning, it said everything that couldn't be spoken. And none of them knew it, but their plans were just unraveling before their eyes, because the man on the far end was not only not backing down, he looked like he was more driven. Then Sunny Hostin finally snapped. Are you really implying then that when you speak out against ideas and policies that are dangerous or harmful to the country that you are being anti-democratic? She shot back, her voice rising with obvious anger. I think some ideas have no place on the microphone and should find them on the dark side of the internet. And just like that, the air around everything in the room floated almost 10 degrees cooler. Eastwood instantly responded. And by whom? He asked, his monotone expression on his face starting to crack just a little. You? The press? A handful of politically aware in New York and Los Angeles found they know everything that the everyday person would be using their supposed intelligence to use? The speed with which the program went into overdrive was incredible. Behind the scenes, everyone was wary of jumping in, though. The producers had faces going form hesitantly, pulled by the pressure of the cameras. He could see a lot of people unsure if they wanted to let this shot go, in case he lost focus, since they would be hard-pressed to top this. The crowd was clearly not sure what to make of this event. Old and young, black and white young weasels and old snails gawked at the act of one of Hollywood's most revered legacies, standing beside the people who suddenly appeared to have seriously underestimated him. But what was truly breathtaking was the first moment had passed, and the real shocking was about to begin. Whoopi Goldberg, who had been so unusually reserved in nearly all of the back and forth, suddenly sat forward. Regulars immediately recognized the expression. It was the look you saw just before the confrontation erupted. Voice calm, barely raised, but within that calm was a certain edge. Clint, if we're being truthful here, she said. Throughout the years, you've loudly declared backing politicians and issues that many consider to have cost minorities dearly. So where do you get off chastising someone else for championing other people's beliefs when they have in effect caused pain and suffering for actual human beings? The effect was instantaneous. There was a collective gasp of shock from the audience, loud enough to be heard clear through the studio. Suddenly, it was no longer political differences, it was a matter of personal responsibility. The talk had gone from commentary to a challenge that went straight for the conscience. Now even the character of Clint Eastwood was in question. His expression instantly shifted, the familiar stern glare, his jaw clenching and setting. When he finally spoke, his tone was lower than before, calmer, but somehow that made it more definite. That's a serious charge there, Whoopi, he asserted. Are you saying that anybody else who sees things differently automatically turns around and worsens people's lives? Because if that's what you're getting at, now that's the sort of thinking that's wrecking our nation. Seeing a chance, Joy Behar jumped on her opportunity, aware that others around her seemed to be losing their momentum. But Clint, you can't deny that she said before, noting some of the people have spoken up for, have used incendiary language. And when you publicly support who are accused of spreading hate, is there not some moral responsibility attached to that? It was as if she had driven a knife straight into the heart of the casual topic. Hate. Never before in this entire conversation had any note of venom in Clint Eastwood's voice. He had been composed and in control, overriding control actually for so long. Hate speech? His voice had suddenly ballooned out from his mouth, filling the room with a new billow of anger. You're telling me I support hate speech now? He rose from his chair with an air of proud challenge. That's rather a serious charge from a panel that spends all its time labeling and attacking people for thinking differently. The wall separating opinion and confrontation had now completely crumbled. There were no more barriers, the gloves were off. Sarah Haynes could felt the episode heading into the dead end and was willing to try the unthinkable one more time. Her voice had become more than just a little tender, and was almost pleading in her desperation to find a safer route. Perhaps we could just shift over to your new film, she suggested hurriedly. There would, I think, be a keen audience for discussing the creative processes and where the plot had come from. The words, however, did not register. They had somehow managed to cross a boundary that no one could, or did want to, go back over. The tone in the room was that something larger than both parties was taking charge of proceedings, and that everyone was committed to exploring it through to its messy conclusion, no matter what that may turn out to be. And they are where the affair took a different direction. Sunny Hostin, convinced that the wave had headed into favorable waters, sought to ride it further still. The problem, Clint, she said with smirking spirit, is that your lot just used the words different perspectives to get away with defending the sorts of ancient ideas that are just not relevant in the 21st century. She felt the answer was almost there. Perhaps some perspectives belong back in the Dark Ages. That was the moment where everything changed. The blasé attitude, the hint that the views expressed were dated and should stay that way, it finally pushed Eastwood over the edge. The man who had made an entire career through perseverance and personality finally looked like he was truly exhausted. Let me tell you something, he said. And at that moment, every single pair of eyes in the room was fixed on him. I have spent over 20 years doing this, and have been subjected to any number of ideologies I wish I could forget. He was staring directly at the other side of the table. And now what you have is people trying to shame someone into agreeing with them because they refuse to subscribe to your form of sane thinking. That is exactly the kind of mental attitude that societies with true liberty should oppose. The words seemed to hit everyone in the face with full momentum. You could see it clearly. The hosts trembled in their seats as the realization it was not the conversation they had secured that was drifting away from them, but instead a very different one. And yet they pressed on. Whoopi fired at him with lightning speed, and without any reflection the authoritarian was received back in kind. A supporter of authoritarianism, are we? She challenged. That's an interesting statement for someone that has supported a number of people, later herded into these very convictions. She edged forward with purpose. Perhaps we are truly not treating you fairly, Clint. Perhaps you have been subjected to something new for the first time. Accountability. And that was it. It would always be remembered as the phrase accountability, and brought the air in the room to ponderous moments lighter. Clint let out a breathy laugh that was anything but humorous. It was sharp, weary, and nearly laced with venom. So that's what we're calling this now? He scoffed and let his head hang, shaking it slowly. An interview that was designed to ambush me live now becomes accountability? His gaze swept over the faces at the table. If this is what accountability looks like, then you've already made my entire case for me about how fractured and diseased public discourse has become. The air in the studio thickened an almost palpable presence, and each second felt more stretched, more taut than the one before. The cameras continued to pan, catching every flicker of expression as the exchange morphed into something no one in the audience had signed up to see, with people in their seats, stunned, several, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the pleasant celebrity visit took on a much more brutal head-on collision trajectory. Then finally Alyssa Farah Griffin interjected, trying to salvage what little professionalism she could from the situation. She'd mostly stayed on the sidelines until this point, but it seemed she recognized things had gone too far. I think we might be moving past why Clint came in here in the first place, she offered carefully. Let's focus on his career, on the stories that he wants to tell through his work. For a fleeting second an out appeared as if by magic, but it vanished in the next. Joy shot her a withering look, irritation etched on her face. Alyssa, we can't pretend that the core issue isn't sitting right in front of us, she said, her voice tight. When people with influence choose to promote harmful ideologies, we have an obligation to talk about it. Harmful ideologies. Eastwood was already jumping in his tone, shifting an edge of menace now clearly audible. Harmful? He sneered. Harmful to the notion that we should be able to think for ourselves? Or maybe, just maybe, the truly dangerous heretical idea is that the media doesn't actually know everything. The sarcasm was thick and undeniable. Sonny shot back without even letting him finish. Don't you sit here and try to play the victim, Clint, she snapped, her voice rising. You've had influence for decades, and what have you done with it other than latch yourself onto concepts that keep the world from advancing or from being equal? Eastwood didn't pause. Who says that it's advancing? He retorted. Who says it's equal? You? This table? He pointed a finger accusingly at the panel members in front of him. You all sit in this little bubble where you just keep confirming everything you already believe, and that somehow means you get to dictate to everyone else in the world how they should think? He leaned forward. Well, the truth is that the world outside of this studio does not revolve around what you all say in this little circle. And with that, any semblance of polite conversation, of interview, of even the pretense of civil discussion was gone. What was left was a brutal, naked confrontation captured on every camera. And just when it seemed the tension couldn't climb any higher, Whoopi leaned in again, the room suddenly falling quiet, every person holding their breath. You know what, Clint? She said, her voice as cold as ice. Perhaps the actual issue is that you've spent so long being adored that you've forgotten what it feels like when someone finally pushes back. She held his gaze. Perhaps someone just needs to remind you that just because you're famous doesn't make you right about everything. The words were like a shot. For the first time all day, Eastwood didn't reply. He simply sat there, silent, unmoving. And somehow that silence spoke volumes louder than anything that had been said before it. Because everyone in that room could feel it. Things had irrevocably changed. And what was about to happen would leave everyone in that room in utter shock. When Clint Eastwood finally broke his spell, it was a noticeable transition. His cool, measured voice, which had ridden with him throughout the interview, disappeared. The epaulette-quality porcupine quill phrasing that had long distinguished him from every other Hollywood man of the moment was gone, replaced by something heavier, something darker, something fiercer. He sounded like someone who had finally been pushed too far after resisting for too long. You know what, ladies, he declared softly. It was a whisper, quiet voice that might have been ignored by the rest of the world at the same time as people in the studio felt like leaning forward in the hope of hearing better. It was not as a whisper, though. It was as the middle of Eastwood's anger was apparently so thunderous that nobody could hear whether he was whispering. I walked into the studio today a courtesy. I came here to talk about movies I've made, tell a few stories, maybe make you all laugh just a little bit. He was sweeping his eyes across the table, and his voice slowly raising for effect. And instead I walked into what appears to be a trap from people who seem convinced by the role they play, judging those of us who will not submit to their political ideologies. He paused, and they could not even see his gaze bouncing off from each host to the next, to the studio floor, just as if he felt like he was measuring the room itself by the camera's light meters. Such a large room in which to feel this much. And you talk about dangerous ideas, he continued. Far too far, the tone of his voice changing to just above a whisper, but the cutting tone that was always in his voice was still there. You tell me what I believe is dangerous. He moved nearer to his audience. I believe it's dangerous to think that disagreeing with the majority makes somebody evil. His words continued to race. It's dangerous to believe that some things are unthinkable. It's dangerous to make the audience feel like the people before them have to choice but to be loyal or subversive. Just as Whoopi opened her mouth, "Stop," Elliot interrupted. And she did. Speechless. I haven't finished, Elliot insisted. You brought me here to sell a movie, or so I was told. However, the only thing you really wanted to do was prosecute me for not conforming. Well, he said, you get there. You've just had a trail, but I don't think you'll like the outcome. Joy Behar, who was obviously feeling the change of tone, was quick to try to steer the interview back to safer ground. Clint, we're having an honest discussion here about important issues, she said. There is no reason to be so defensive. Eastwood let out another little chuckle, but this time you could hear the claws. Defensive, he echoed. Over 60 years in this town, I've had studio heads, agents, politicians, every kind of shark in the record book bite at my ankles. And I can tell you this, I haven't seen a more dishonest effort at cornering anybody since I sat down at this table today. His shrill voice dropped another octave. And I don't know if someone here was trying to tempt me to jump over the table and bite at their ankles, or just catch some air, but I can tell you I haven't had anybody put together an attack like this in an awful long time. With that, there was an air of chaos in the room. No one was saying anything immediately after his comment. The hosts looked at one another quickly in trepidation. For the first time in the day, nervousness flashed across their faces. The administration they thought they had in their hand was leading them nowhere they expected to go. The old man they saw fidgeting in the chair wasn't ready to cry uncle. He was ready to fight back. Sonny Hostin, who had been conducting the interview all morning, now tried to take back the floor. The technique we're trying to apply here is not ambushing anyone, she said. We're asking real questions about what it means to have influence. Influence. That was the word about to resonate loudest in the room. For as soon as it fell off the lips, anyone could tell Eastwood was already preparing to use it. Eastwood's expression hardened, and every word he spoke was suddenly laced with a raw, unfiltered edge. You want to talk to me about responsibility? He drawled, the words dripping with an unmistakable weariness. Let's talk about responsibility. He didn't rush. He let each word land, hang, and then sink. Responsibility means engaging in a discussion, not shutting it down before it's even begun. Responsibility means treating people with respect and not setting up situations for public humiliation. And responsibility means having the maturity to recognize when you've overstepped your bounds rather than doubling down even further. And then, with an economy of movement that nevertheless altered the entire dynamic of the room, Eastwood slowly began to stand. The action wasn't overtly confrontational, but the impact was instantaneous. Every single eye in the studio turned to him. The audience watched breathless as a moment that felt so much larger than a celebrity interview unfolded. They were watching someone refuse to be broken in real time. But responsibility more than anything, he continued, his voice now resonating with the kind of gravitas that had defined countless movie roles, means having the maturity to know when a line has been crossed, and the good sense to back away. He gave one last long look across the table, at the women he felt had so thoroughly failed to meet this simple standard. And since that isn't happening here today, I'm going to do what I probably should have done from the second I realized what this was turning into. The tension in the room crackled like static, so thick it felt suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. The cameras continued to roll, documenting the disintegration of what had been a planned interview and was now something entirely different. Whoopi, ever the professional, tried one last time to smooth things over. Clint, sit down, she pleaded, her voice a little strained. We can be adults about this. Eastwood simply turned, his gaze locked forward, and replied in a low, measured tone that somehow boomed even louder than shouting would have. Adults? He repeated, his eyes still fixed on some unseen point in the distance. You think that was adult behavior? His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a knife. I was asked here to speak about something, and suddenly it's a different conversation altogether. And when I try to push back, I'm the one in the wrong. Each word was a precisely aimed projectile. If that's what passes for maturity, count me out. And then another small, almost insignificant movement that somehow felt earth-shattering. Slowly, deliberately, Eastwood reached up and took off his microphone. It was such a simple gesture, but it held the definitive weight of a final decision. Everyone in the room seemed to know it at the same time. I've been around long enough to recognize a change of circumstances, he said, his voice still clear and audible in the studio, without the mic attached. And I'm old enough to know that I don't need to waste my time somewhere that conversation is just supposed to stop. As he began to turn away, Joy Behar called out after him, Clint, wait a minute. Don't you think that's a little extreme? We're just talking here. Eastwood paused just at the edge of the stage and turned back one last time. There was no anger on his face now, but something even more profound. Disappointment, weariness, the look of someone who had had high hopes and had them systematically and completely dashed.